Part 1. The smaller lie and the bigger one hiding behind it. By now, you may already know the first correction. You may have learned somewhere along the way that the Great Depression did not actually begin on that famous October morning in 1929 when the stock market collapsed and men in good suits stood staring at the ticker in disbelief. You may have heard that the crash was a symptom, not the disease, that the real damage came later and from somewhere else. Good. That means you're ahead of most people. But I have to tell you something uncomfortable. That correction, the crash wasn't the cause, is the small lie. It's the beginner's version of the truth. It's the thing you learn once you've read a little more than the textbook, and it makes you feel like you've seen behind the curtain. But behind that first curtain, there is a second one, and behind the second curtain is a lie so large, so comfortable, and so widely believed that it shapes how we talk about economic disasters to this very day. Here is the biggest lie about the Great Depression. It is the quiet assumption underneath almost every version of the story, including the sophisticated ones. The lie is that the Great Depression was a kind of natural disaster, an economic hurricane, a once-in-a-century storm that formed out over the ocean of the business cycle, made landfall, and flattened everything in its path, and that all anyone could really do was board up the windows and wait for it to pass. In that version, the Depression is something that happened to the world. Nobody's fault, nobody's choice. A force of nature that simply had to run its course. That is the lie. And I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes proving it to you because the way we prove it is genuinely one of the most fascinating stories in economic history. And it hinges on a piece of evidence that almost every documentary about the crash leaves out entirely. Because here's the thing about a natural disaster. A hurricane doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't recover faster for the country that makes a good decision and slower for the country that makes a bad one. But the Great Depression did exactly that. It lifted off different nations at wildly different times in a pattern so clear, so precise, that once you see it, you can never again believe the storm was in charge. The Depression ended for each country not when the suffering had done its work, not when some natural cycle turned, but at the exact moment that countries' leaders made a specific decision. Some made it early, some made it late, and their people paid or were spared in direct proportion. That is not weather. That is a choice made by human beings, repeated across a dozen countries with a control group. So the biggest lie isn't the crash. The biggest lie is that nobody was driving. And to understand who was driving and why they drove the world off a cliff, while sincerely believing they were saving it, we have to start not with a stock market, but with an idea, a respectable, reasonable, catastrophic idea. Part 2, the idea that suffering was the cure. In the early days of the collapse, as businesses began to fail and men began to lose their jobs, the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, later remembered the advice he was getting from the most powerful financial mind in his government. His Treasury Secretary was Andrew Mellon, one of the richest men in America, a banker and industrialist of enormous prestige. And according to Hoover, Mellon's prescription for the crisis was chillingly simple. Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Let the whole thing collapse, Mellon supposedly argued. Let the weak businesses die and the reckless investors lose everything and the overpriced farms and houses crash back down to nothing. It will, in his words, purge the rottenness out of the system. People will work harder. They'll live more moral lives. The worthy will pick up the wreckage left by the unworthy. The pain in this view wasn't a tragedy to be prevented. The pain was the cure. Now, I have to be honest with you here, because this channel is not in the business of turning history into a comic book. That quotation comes from Hoover's memoirs, written many years after the events, and Hoover had every reason to make his own Treasury Secretary look like a heartless villain so that he himself could look like the enlightened man who resisted him. Some historians doubt Mellon ever said those exact words. Mellon's public statements were more measured, and Hoover, for his part, was actually a far more active and interventionist president than the caricature allows. But and this is the important part, whether or not Mellon spoke that precise sentence almost doesn't matter because the idea behind it was everywhere. It had a name among economists, liquidationism. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter warned against artificially stimulating the economy because in his view, that would leave the necessary work of the Depression undone. All across the corridors of power, in treasuries and central banks and newspaper editorials, respectable men shared a deep conviction that the boom of the 1920s had been an orgy of excess and speculation, and that the bust was nature's way of restoring balance. To interfere with the collapse, to soften it, to prop things up, that would be to cheat. It would only delay the reckoning and make the eventual pain worse. Sit with how seductive that idea is because it is the emotional heart of the biggest lie. It tells you that the suffering is meaningful, that it's deserved, that there is a moral logic to the hunger and the foreclosures and the shuttered factories. It transforms a policy failure into a morality tale, and it hands the people in charge the most comfortable excuse in the world. There is nothing we can do, and even if there were, we shouldn't, because the pain is the medicine. Hold on to that idea. Suffering as necessary medicine because it's going to walk beside us through this entire story. It's the ghost in the machine. And by the end, you're going to watch it get demolished by the evidence in real time, in the actual historical record. But first, we have to understand the machine that this idea was operating inside. Because liquidationism didn't collapse the world economy by itself. It had a partner, a beautiful, respectable, and utterly rigid piece of machinery that governed the entire planet's money. And to understand the Great Depression, you have to understand that machine and why, in a crisis, it was designed to do exactly the wrong thing. Part 3. The ground rules. Before we open the machine up, 2 quick guardrails because this kind of history attracts nonsense from 2 directions. The first is the search for a single villain. It is tempting to find one greedy banker, one stupid president, one evil law, and pin the whole catastrophe to him. History almost never works that way, and it certainly didn't here. What we're going to find instead is a system in which many intelligent, well-meaning people each made a defensible decision, and the sum of those defensible decisions was a disaster. That's harder to accept than a villain, because you can't fire a system. The second is the conspiracy. Somewhere in the comments of every video like this, someone will insist that the Depression was secretly engineered by a hidden cabal, usually with an ethnic label attached. Let me be plain. There is no evidence for it, and the impulse behind it is not analysis. It's prejudice looking for a costume. Real bankers, real politicians, real central bankers made real decisions in the open for reasons we can read in their own words. The truth needs no secret room. And one more thing, because it matters for trust. Throughout this, I'll try to separate what we know from primary sources, the actual speeches, laws, telegrams, and data left behind, from the interpretations that historians and economists have layered on top. The facts of what happened are largely settled. Why it happened is still argued over by brilliant people, and I'll show you those arguments rather than pretend there's only one, because the honest version of history is more interesting than the tidy one. Now, the machine. Part 4, the golden trap, a system built to fail in a crisis. For most of the world in the decades before the First World War, money meant gold. The major economies tied their currencies directly to it. A pound, a dollar, a franc, a mark, each was in effect a paper claim on a specific weight of gold sitting in a vault. This was the gold standard, and to the people who ran the world's finances, it was not merely a policy. It was closer to a religion. Gold was honesty. Gold was discipline. Gold was the thing that stopped politicians from printing money whenever they wanted to buy votes or fight wars. A currency backed by gold was a promise a government couldn't easily break. And under stable conditions, the system had a kind of elegant self-correction built in. If a country bought too much from abroad, gold would flow out of its vaults to pay for it. Less gold meant the country had to shrink its money supply. A smaller money supply pushed prices down. Cheaper prices made that country's exports attractive again, so gold flowed back. In and out, back and forth, The system was supposed to keep every nation roughly in balance, automatically, without anyone having to decide anything. It was the closest thing the 19th century had to a self-driving economy. Then the First World War smashed it. To pay for 4 years of industrial slaughter, governments abandoned the discipline of gold and printed money on a scale the old system was never built to survive. And when the war ended, the world was a completely different financial place. The gold hadn't stayed where it used to be. Enormous quantities of it had drained across the Atlantic to the United States, which had sold weapons and food to everyone and emerged as the planet's dominant creditor. Later, France would begin hoarding gold at an astonishing rate as well. So by the mid-1920s, two countries, the United States and France, sat on top of a huge share of the entire world's monetary gold, while everyone else scraped to defend their currencies with reserves that kept draining away. And here is where the sincere men made their fatal mistake. Looking at the chaos of the post-war years, the inflations, the unstable currencies, the political disorder, they concluded that the solution was obvious. Go back, restore the gold standard, rebuild the beautiful machine that had kept the pre-war world stable. Between the mid-1920s and the end of the decade, one country after another climbed back onto gold, often at exchange rates chosen for reasons of national pride rather than economic reality. They were trying to rebuild a house of the pre-war world on the foundations of a post-war one, and the rebuilt gold standard had a flaw at its very center, a flaw that turned it from a mechanism for stability into a machine for transmitting catastrophe. This is the single most important idea in the whole story, so let me put it as plainly as I can. Under the gold standard, when a financial panic hits your country, when banks start to fail and people rush to pull out their savings, your central bank faces an impossible choice. In a banking panic, the right move, the move that stops the bleeding, is for the central bank to flood the system with money, to act as what economists call the lender of last resort, to stand behind the banks and say, there is enough cash, calm down, your money is safe. That's how you break a panic. But you cannot do that and defend the gold standard at the same time, because flooding your economy with money under the gold rules sends a signal to the rest of the world that your currency is about to weaken, and foreign investors will respond by demanding you convert their paper into gold and yank it out of your vaults before it's too late. The very act of saving your banks triggers a run on your gold. So the gold standard forced every country in a crisis to choose between two things it desperately needed: save the banking system or defend the currency. And the rules, the sacred, disciplined, honest rules, told them every time to defend the currency, to raise interest rates into a collapse, to starve the economy of money at the exact moment it was suffocating. The economic historian Barry Eichengreen gave this idea its perfect name. He called it golden fetters, chains made of gold. A system that its defenders believed was the guarantor of stability had become the handcuffs that prevented anyone from stopping the disaster. And notice how neatly it fused with the idea from earlier. Liquidationism said the pain was necessary. The gold standard said your hands were tied. Together, they produced the most dangerous combination in the history of economic policy. An ideology that told leaders they shouldn't act, welded, to a system that told them they couldn't. That was the machine. Now let's watch it seize. Part 5, the engine seizes. America, 1929 to 1931. America in the late 1920s looked like the future itself. But underneath the skyscrapers and the assembly lines and the soaring stock prices, the foundation was cracked in ways we've explored before. Wages. That hadn't kept pace with production. An economy where too much of the wealth had pooled at the very top. Ordinary families papering over the gap with installment credit, buying today with money they hope to earn tomorrow. When too few people can afford to buy what the factories are producing, an economy is running on borrowed confidence. And confidence, unlike steel, can vanish overnight. In October 1929, it vanished. The stock market collapsed, wiping out fortunes and, more importantly, wiping out the sense of invincibility that had propped up the whole edifice. But, and I cannot stress this enough, a stock market crash is survivable. America had crashed before and recovered. Markets fall, economies absorb the blow, life goes on. In late 1929, What had happened was a severe shock, but it was not yet a catastrophe. The catastrophe was a choice that came next, and it was made by the one institution specifically created to prevent exactly this kind of disaster: the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve had been founded in 1913 for one central purpose: to be the lender of last resort, to stand behind the banking system so that a panic in one place couldn't cascade into a collapse everywhere. And in the early 1930s, as waves of bank failures swept across the country, the Federal Reserve did far too little. When frightened depositors rushed to pull their savings out, healthy banks and sick banks alike began to fall. Each failure destroyed the savings inside it. Each failure frightened depositors at the next bank down the road. And the Fed, the institution built to break exactly this chain reaction, largely stood aside. The numbers that followed are almost hard to comprehend. Between 1930 and 1933, something like 7,000 to 9,000 American banks failed. Close to a third of the entire banking system simply ceased to exist. And here's the mechanism that turned a recession into the Great Depression. When a bank fails, the money inside it doesn't just move somewhere else, it disappears. So as thousands of banks died, the actual quantity of money in the American economy collapsed. The economists Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in the study that reshaped how we understand all of this, showed that the U.S. money supply fell by roughly a third between 1929 and 1933. For every $3 circulating in the economy at the start, only 2 were left at the bottom. Think about what that means. It's not that people made bad choices with their money, it's that a third of the money itself evaporated. And when the money supply shrinks that violently, prices have to fall to match. And fall they did, by around a quarter. Now layer on one more mechanism identified by the economist Irving Fisher, who watched it happen and gave it a name: debt deflation. When prices and wages fall, but your debts stay the same, every debt gets heavier, the mortgage you took out is now enormous relative to your shrunken income, so you cut spending to make the payments. But your cut spending is someone else's lost income, so they cut too, and prices fall further, which makes all the debts heavier still. The economy eats itself. Falling prices, rising real debt, more defaults, more bank failures, less money, lower prices, around and around, a spiral pulling downward. By the depths of 1933, American economic output had fallen by nearly a third. 1 in 4 workers had no job, 25% unemployment, and no meaningful safety net to catch them. And here's the question that exposes the biggest lie. If this was a natural disaster, why did the institution built to stop it just watch? Were they simply incompetent? No. And this is where our 2 villains reappear. The Federal Reserve didn't fail purely out of stupidity. It failed because too many of the people inside it believed the 2 things we've already met. They believed, in the spirit of liquidationism, that the collapse was a necessary purge, that propping up failing banks would only reward recklessness and delay the healthy correction. And they believed they were fettered by gold, that aggressive action to save the banks would drain the nation's gold reserves and shatter the sacred link. There was one man who might have fought both of those beliefs, a central banker named Benjamin Strong, the head of the New York Federal Reserve, who understood the Fed's power to break panics and had the force of personality to use it. But Strong had died in 1928, just before the storm. Friedman and Schwartz argued that his death left a vacuum at the top of the Fed, filled by smaller men with more timid and more orthodox views at the worst possible moment. So the machine seized. Not because no one could turn the wheel, but because the people at the wheel sincerely believed they weren't supposed to. And if the story ended in America, it would already be a tragedy. But it didn't end in America, because the golden fetters didn't just chain one country, they chained every country to every other. And in 1931, in a city most people telling this story never even mention, the chains yanked the whole world down together. Part 6. The Forgotten Center of the Disaster. Europe, 1931. Here is the part of the story that almost never makes it into the American version, and it might be the most important year of the entire Depression. Not 1929, 1931. Travel to Vienna, the capital of what was left of Austria after the war had dismembered its old empire. In Vienna stood a bank called the Credit Anstalt. It was not just a big bank. It was, by a wide margin, the largest bank in Austria, larger by some measures than all the other Austrian banks combined, and it was wired into the finances of Central and Eastern Europe like a central nervous system. Founded generations earlier by the Rothschild family, it was the kind of institution people assumed simply could not fail. In May of 1931, it announced that it had lost the vast majority of its capital. The most trusted bank in the region was, in effect, insolvent. What happened next was the golden fetters in action on an international scale. Panic erupted. Depositors ran to pull their money out of the Credit Anstalt and then out of any bank that looked remotely like it. The Austrian government tried to guarantee the bank's debts to restore calm, but that only spread the fear to the government's own finances. And then the panic did what panic does under a gold standard. It jumped borders. Frightened money doesn't respect nationality. Runs began on banks in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Poland, and above all in Germany, which was already staggering under war debts and reparations. I have to pause here for the honesty this channel owes you, because the neat version of this story, one Austrian bank collapsed and toppled the world like a domino, has been challenged by serious historians. The scholar Nathan Marcus, for instance, has argued that the Austrian authorities actually contained the Credit Anstalt crisis reasonably quickly with help from other central banks, and that the German catastrophe that followed grew mostly from Germany's own problems, not from Austrian contagion. So the truth is more textured than the dramatic domino image. But whether or not you buy the strict chain of falling dominoes, this much is not in dispute. 1931 was the year the crisis went from an American slump to a global financial inferno, and the fire spread fastest and hottest across a Europe locked into the gold standard, where no central bank could flood the system to stop a run without triggering a run on its gold instead. By July 1931, Germany, facing a full-scale banking collapse, did something that would have been unthinkable to the guardians of the old order. Rather than let its gold drain away entirely, it effectively slammed its financial borders shut, imposing strict controls on money leaving the country. It was, in practice, a partial abandonment of the free gold standard. The most disciplined economy in Europe had begun to break the sacred rules, not out of ideology, but out of desperation. And then came the moment that shattered the religion at its own altar. The panic rolled westward from Germany and crashed onto London. Investors began pulling gold out of Britain, the very heart of the old gold standard world, the nation whose currency, the pound sterling, had been the anchor of global finance for a century. Britain faced the impossible choice the fetters imposed on everyone: strangle your own dying economy with even higher interest rates to defend the gold, or let the gold go. And in September 1931, Britain, the high priest of the gold standard, the country that had practically invented modern central banking, walked away from gold. It's hard to overstate the psychological earthquake of that decision. One British official reportedly marveled that he hadn't known you were even allowed to do that, the thing everyone, the IC, had treated as an immovable law of nature, a pillar of civilization itself, turned out to be a choice all along. You could just stop. And the moment Britain stopped, something remarkable began to happen. Something that is the smoking gun in our case against the biggest lie. Because Britain, having broken its golden fetters, began to recover, while the countries that kept their fetters on kept sinking. That contrast between the nations that broke the rules and the nations that clung to them is the natural experiment I promised you at the very beginning. And when you lay it all out, it doesn't just wound the lie that the Depression was an unavoidable natural disaster. It kills it. Part 7. The natural experiment. The proof it was a choice. Imagine you're a scientist and you want to test whether the gold standard was really the thing prolonging the Depression. You couldn't run that experiment on purpose. You can't take a dozen countries and assign half of them to keep the gold standard and half to drop it just to see what happens. It would be monstrous. But history tragically ran that exact experiment for us, because in the 1930s, different countries left the gold standard at different times for their own reasons, and we can simply watch what happened to each one afterward. This is the work that the economist Barry Eichengreen and others assembled into one of the most persuasive arguments in all of economic history. When you sort the countries of the world by when they abandoned the gold standard and then look at when they started to recover, the pattern is almost eerily clean. The earlier a country broke its golden fetters, the earlier it began to climb out of the Depression. The longer it clung to gold, the longer its people suffered. Watch the pattern. Britain broke free in 1931 and turned the corner relatively early. Sweden, a small country that followed Britain off gold within days, went further. Its central bank openly declared that its new job was to stabilize prices, not to defend a lump of metal. And Sweden became one of the mildest and quickest recoveries in Europe. And then there's the case that should be far more famous than it is: Japan. In late 1931, Japan's finance minister, a man named Takahashi Korekiyo, took Japan off gold, let the currency fall, and deliberately spent government money to reflate the economy, cutting interest rates and running deficits to put demand back into people's hands. He did roughly what the economist John Maynard Keynes would soon argue every country should do, and he did it years before Keynes formally wrote it down. Japan pulled out of the Depression faster than almost any major nation on Earth. Takahashi has been called, with good reason, the man who saved Japan from the Great Depression. He was murdered by militarists in 1936, in part because he later tried to rein in the military spending his own recovery had made possible. But that's a darker story for another day. Now look at the other side of the experiment. Look at the countries that kept the faith. A cluster of nations, led by France and joined by Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and others, refused to let go. They formed what came to be called the Gold Bloc, and they gripped the gold standard with almost religious determination, while their economies bled. France, which had emerged from the 1920s relatively strong precisely because of all that hoarded gold, now found itself trapped by its own treasure. It stayed on gold, stayed rigid, stayed deflationary. And its depression, which arrived later than everyone else's, also lasted longer, dragging on grimly for years after the countries that had abandoned gold were climbing back. France would not finally devalue and release itself until 1936, and it paid for the delay in stagnation and political turmoil. And the United States? America gripped the gold standard through the very worst of it, through the banking collapses, through the 25% unemployment, through the debt deflation spiral, all the way until 1933. Then a new president took office, Franklin Roosevelt, and in the spring of 1933, he did the thing his predecessors had considered unthinkable. He broke the link. He took the United States off the pure gold standard, stopped defending the old fixed price, and freed the government to expand money and credit into the economy. And the response was immediate and dramatic. Industrial production, which had been flat on its back, surged in the months right after the break. It wasn't the whole recovery. The road ahead was long and uneven, and full employment wouldn't truly return until the enormous spending of the Second World War. But the turning point, the moment the freefall stopped and the climb began, lines up with startling precision against the moment America broke its golden fetters. Now step back and look at the whole experiment at once. The countries that left gold early, Britain, Sweden, Japan, recovered early. The countries that left gold late, the United States in 1933, recovered late. The countries that clung to gold longest, the Gold Bloc, France above all, suffered longest. The timing of each nation's escape from the Depression matches the timing of its decision to break the rules over and over across the entire developed world. That is not what a natural disaster looks like. A hurricane doesn't spare the country that repeals a law. A flood doesn't recede faster for the nation that changes its monetary policy. This pattern, this clean, repeated cross-country correspondence between a human decision and the end of the suffering, is the fingerprint of a man-made catastrophe. The Depression didn't lift when the pain had finished its purifying work, the way the liquidationists promised it would. It lifted when governments stopped believing they had to suffer, when they broke the chains they had forged for themselves, which leaves us with the strangest and most human question in the whole story. If breaking the rules brought recovery, and everyone could see some version of this happening in real time, why on earth did so many nations wait so long? Why did France hold on for years while its economy rotted? Why did the men in charge cling to a system that was visibly destroying the thing it was supposed to protect? The answer isn't stupidity. It's something much more unsettling, and it's the deepest lesson this history has to teach. Part 8. Why they clung. The prison of certainty. To understand why intelligent, patriotic, well-meaning people held onto the gold standard while their societies came apart, you have to understand that to them, gold was never just an economic tool. Eichengreen and the economist Peter Temin described the mindset perfectly. They called it the gold standard mentality, a whole world view, shared across the elite of nearly every country, in which abandoning gold wasn't merely a policy option that might not work. It was a betrayal, a descent into chaos, a national dishonor. And you have to remember what these people had lived through, because their fear was not irrational. Many of them had personally witnessed the nightmare of the early 1920s, when currencies untethered from gold had spun into hyperinflation. In Germany, they had watched the mark become so worthless that people burned it for heat and carried their wages in wheelbarrows, watched a lifetime of savings evaporate in weeks, watched the middle class get wiped out and the social order tremble. To a generation scarred by that memory, the gold standard was the wall holding back the flood. Suggesting they tear it down sounded to them like suggesting they invite the hyperinflation nightmare back in. So they held the wall, even as a different flood, deflation, the exact opposite disaster, rose behind them and drowned everything anyway. They were so afraid of the last catastrophe that they couldn't see the new one until it was on top of them. Layer the liquidationist idea on top of that fear, and the prison is complete. The gold standard mentality told them abandoning gold would bring chaos. Liquidationism told them the suffering they saw was necessary and even healthy. Between the two, every instinct pointed toward do nothing, hold the line, endure. And so they held the line, and their people endured. This is the part I most want you to carry out of this video because it's the part that reaches past 1931 and touches every era, including our own. The men who prolonged the Great Depression were not, for the most part, cruel men or foolish men or corrupt men. They were certain men. They were people so convinced of the rightness of their framework. Gold is discipline, discipline is virtue, pain is purifying, intervention is cheating. That the mounting evidence of catastrophe couldn't penetrate it. Every bank that failed, every family thrown out of its home, every hungry child could be filed under necessary correction or the price of stability. Their certainty didn't just fail to prevent the disaster. Their certainty was the disaster, or a huge part of it. That's the thing about the biggest lie. It wasn't invented by liars. It was believed sincerely and passionately by some of the most respectable people alive. The lie that the suffering was natural, unavoidable, and even beneficial wasn't cynical propaganda. It was a genuine conviction, and that made it far more dangerous than any cynical lie could ever be. A liar can be caught. A sincerely certain man defending a beautiful idea against the evidence of his own eyes is much, much harder to stop. And while they held their beautiful idea, the world burned. And out of that fire came something even worse than economic ruin. Part 9. The bill nobody put on the ledger. We have spent this whole story in the realm of gold reserves and money supplies and policy decisions, and that can make a catastrophe feel abstract, like a problem on a chalkboard. So before we draw the lessons, I want to make it real for a moment, because behind every number was a life. 25% unemployment is not a statistic. It's a man leaving his house each morning in a clean shirt so the neighbors won't know he has nowhere to go. It's a family selling the furniture, then the wedding ring, then moving in with relatives, then moving into a shack on the edge of town. It's children who learn to be quiet about being hungry. It's savings, the careful accumulation of a whole working life entrusted to a bank because that's what responsible people did, simply gone one morning when the doors didn't open. The deepest cruelty of the Depression was how it turned catastrophe into shame, because the liquidationist idea had a shadow side. If the suffering was a purge of the unworthy, then to suffer was to be marked as unworthy. Millions of decent people absorbed the lie into their own hearts and believed that their ruin was a verdict on their character, when in truth, they were being crushed by decisions made in rooms they would never see. And here is where the man-made catastrophe stops being merely economic and becomes something that reshaped the entire century. Look again at where the deflation was harshest, at the countries that gripped the gold standard and squeezed their economies hardest to defend it. Look, especially, at Germany. In the early 1930s, Germany was governed by a chancellor named Heinrich Brüning, who responded to the crisis with brutal austerity, cutting wages, cutting spending, forcing prices down, in large part to defend the currency and to prove to the world that Germany could no longer pay its reparations. He earned a bitter nickname, the Hunger Chancellor. His deflation deepened the misery at the exact moment German democracy most needed to deliver hope. And in those same years, as unemployment climbed and the deflation bit, a fringe party that had been a joke a few years earlier began winning elections. Its leader offered the two things a terrified, humiliated population craved: someone to blame and the promise that he alone could fix it. I want to be careful here because history is not a machine with one lever, and it would be too simple to say the gold standard produced Hitler. It didn't, not by itself. But it is not a coincidence that the countries which deflated hardest and longest, which inflicted the most self-imposed suffering in defense of monetary orthodoxy, were so often the ones where democracy cracked and extremism surged. Economic despair is the soil in which the ugliest politics grows, and the despair, in this case, was deepened by choice, by the certain men holding their beautiful idea, defending the gold and the purge while the ground gave way beneath the societies they were supposedly protecting. The road to the Second World War had many builders, but some of its pavement was laid unknowingly by central bankers who believed with all their hearts that they were preserving stability. That is the true price of the biggest lie. Not just the wealth destroyed, but the faith destroyed. Faith in banks, in markets, in governments, in the idea that the people in charge understood what ordinary people were living through. And when that faith collapses, something always rushes in to fill the vacuum. It's rarely something good. Part 10. Why the lie survives and why it still matters. So why does the biggest lie persist? If the evidence is this clear, if the recovery pattern is this obvious, if the natural experiment is this clean, why do we still, deep down, talk about the Great Depression as a storm that struck rather than a disaster that was made and then unmade by human hands? Because the lie is comforting and the truth is heavy. If the Depression was a natural disaster, then nobody has to be responsible, and more importantly, nobody has to feel the weight of knowing it could have been shorter. The natural disaster story lets everyone off the hook: the central bankers, the treasury secretaries, the whole certain generation. It turns a preventable decade of ruin into an unlucky season of bad weather. That's a much easier thing to live with. The truth, that the length and depth of the suffering was, to a real degree, a choice, is almost unbearable, precisely because it means these things are always, at least partly, choices. But that heaviness is also the gift this history gives us, if we're willing to take it. Because if the Depression was made by decisions, then it could be prevented by better ones. And the astonishing thing is, we have the proof that the lesson took. Fast forward to 2008, to the worst financial crisis since the 1930s. Banks were failing, credit was freezing, the machinery was seizing up in ways that looked terrifyingly familiar. And the man running the American Federal Reserve was Ben Bernanke, who, before he was a central banker, had spent his academic life studying one thing above all others: the Great Depression. He had literally written the papers on how the banking collapse and the credit freeze had turned a recession into a catastrophe. And in 2008, faced with the echo of that catastrophe, he did the exact opposite of what his predecessors had done in the 1930s. He flooded the system with liquidity. He acted as the lender of last resort, aggressively, without apology. There was no gold standard left to fetter him, and he refused to be paralyzed by the idea that the pain was necessary medicine. The result was a severe recession, but not a second Great Depression. 10% unemployment instead of 25. A bad few years instead of a lost decade. That is what it looks like when a society learns to reject the biggest lie. It doesn't mean the pain vanishes. It means we stop pretending the pain is fate, and the lie keeps trying to come back, dressed in new clothes, which is why this history is not a museum piece. Think about the countries of the Eurozone after 2010. Greece, above all. locked into a shared currency they couldn't devalue, unable to print their own money, forced to defend their position through brutal austerity, while unemployment soared past 25% and a generation of young people found no work. Economists noticed the resemblance immediately and started calling the euro a modern set of golden fetters, a rigid monetary system that, in a crisis, forces the weakest members to swallow deflation and suffering to defend the rules. Whether or not you agree with that comparison, the shape of the argument should sound extremely familiar by now. A beautiful, disciplined system defended by certain men, imposing necessary suffering on people who never chose it. So here is what I hope you carry away from all of this. The next time a crisis comes, and it will, and someone with a serious voice and an impressive title tells you that nothing can be done, that the suffering is unavoidable, that the pain is simply the medicine the system needs, and we must all endure it with discipline. I want you to remember 1931. Remember that this exact idea, spoken by exactly that kind of person, prolonged the worst economic catastrophe of the modern age. Remember that the men who said it were not villains, but believers, and that their sincerity was precisely what made them so dangerous. And remember the recovery. Remember that the suffering ended not when it had finished purging the rottenness, but when leaders finally found the courage to say, the rules are ours, we made them, and we can change them. The stock market crash of 1929 was real, and it was frightening, and it mattered. But it was the sound of breaking glass, not the reason the house fell. The biggest lie about the Great Depression was never about the crash. The biggest lie is that it was nobody's fault and nothing could be done. And the truest thing this history can teach us is that economic catastrophes are not weather. They are built. And what human beings build, human beings can choose to tear down. If this changed the way you see not just the Great Depression, but the way we talk about every crisis since, then subscribe, because on this channel we go behind the simple stories to find the decisions underneath, the ones the textbooks flatten and the ones the people in charge would rather you forget. Tell me in the comments which idea unsettled you the most. The gold standard as a set of chains, the doctrine that suffering was the cure, or the recovery experiment that proves the whole thing was a choice. And if you believe, as I do, that understanding how the last catastrophe was made and unmade is the best protection against the next one, then like this video so it reaches someone who still thinks it all started on Wall Street. I'll see you in the next investigation.